Okay, so let's get started. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Jessica Rubenstein. I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions Coordination here at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Welcome to our Pacifica Graduate Institute webinar offerings. I'd like to introduce Dr. Oksana Yakushko. She is a core faculty in the PhD in Clinical Psychology program here at Pacific Graduate Institute. The webinar title is 11 Times of Pandemic, Engaged Visions of Clinical Depth Psychology. So we're gonna hear a brief lecture and then Dr. Yakushko is also going to briefly go over the program and also what she's looking for in applicants of the program. So let's get started. And then for the last 15 minutes, starting at 12:45, I'll also take some Q&A. So if you have any questions for Dr. Yakushko, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. With that, let's get started.
Hello, everybody. Warm welcome to this webinar. And in this time of pandemic of both health and social proportions, I hope that you, your families, and your communities are as well and safe as can be. And in these times that we, have to do these experiences entirely in these formats by Zoom. But I also hope that it reaches out to many of you and possibilities of exploring Pacifica, from distance. So what I want to present to you will cover both kind of visions of depth psychology in relation to what is happening currently in the world. Also, I will share with you about ways of attending to histories and looking at history that is. Oops, I'm going to see myself in ways that are important for us because they frame ways that we as communities, as individuals, as societies have responded to things like health pandemics or other difficult social disasters like wars or climate disasters and so forth. So, of course, those of you familiar with Gabriela Garcia Marquez's work, he is Colombian um, writer, a remarkable writer, and who writes, he uses, it's a play on his titles of his books. But if you, of course, know some of his work, which is magical realism work, there are ways that our humanity, being human in these times or times past when we faced all kinds of pandemics and challenges to now, is very dynamic and contextual, right? It's like, those kind of terms come to mind. Also, very human and can be very both painful and enlivening at the same time. And so I just want to kind of invite us into the space of listening to histories and listening to ways that we at Pacifica, I would say, as a faculty envision these kind of ways of what it means to be a depth psychologist working in times like these and facing the social and health and the other world realities and as humans, as our own and professionals. So in this presentation, I hope that you will hear ways that I will try to hold what is depth psychology and what are possibilities of being clinicians, scholars, writers, activists in these times, and connected to kind of vision, I think, that we try to bring into format of learning, academic learning experience in psychology. Um, uh, Pacifica doctoral training is not new. It's been around over 30 years. We have graduates um, who are working in all kinds of settings around the world. But I also, what we hold on to is the real importance of both holding the kind of origins and original theories and theorists in-depth traditions, but also also openly recognizing that they too wrote in their own context, and we always are taking up what they began and critiquing, questioning, building on it. Never, these are not the truths to come back to, but ideas to build on. So what I will hopefully you will see is the way I take up depth psychology, and I want to extend it to ways that you begin to think about what it would mean to you, or what it means to be a clinician with depth psychological perspective in these times too. For my kind of slide here, oops, I can't see this. Oh, I pardon me, you guys. Um, the three program goals for us, which you will hear reflected, are clinical depth psychological training. So we are definitely in the business of looking for people interested in applied clinical care. We show up for all kinds of things, including um, facing death and social violence and fears and crises, and as well as we show up for ways we love in the midst of it, and we change, and we are experience ourselves in new different ways. So the three program goals, therefore, the first, as I mentioned, is clinical depth psychological work. We and Second one is depth psychological research traditions that we also study. Study history, study contemporary experience, study human experience within human science orientation. I encourage you to go to our website to learn more. It's a contrast to natural paradigm, natural view, natural science view that studies humans from a perspective of what is kind of a form of natural science. Um, and we dialogue with that perspective, but emphasize human science perspective, including depth psychological human science perspective that looks into the unconscious assumptions that are both in research and are there in ourselves. And then the last one is social justice and social action. And so I'm going to, and you'll see in my presentation, to continually what Daniel Gastambide in his People's History of Psychoanalysis calls psychoanalytic ethic, and what also liberation psychologists such as Mary Watkins and Pacifica refer to as, these ethics of care and liberation perspectives, which is to look into what and who is being split off, marginalized, and projected. And that occurs within us. What kind of states of mind, feelings, experiences, what are kind of pieces of ourselves that are really big parts of us, whether it's racial identification, gender, ethnicity, religion, or sexuality. How is it being sometimes split off, marginalized, projected into, unheld, denied, minimized, or and how do we interact with the world around us. So we teach a lot of theory, um, as did early psychoanalytic and Jungian scholars, and as do most of them today, to help understand human experience, which you always bring to clinical work. So what I write about, and I came about to this interest kind of roundabout way, is I, began to write as a scholar early in my graduate school days, and then in my early days in Research One academia, writing on immigrant experiences, including xenophobia. What I discovered is that historians of racism, xenophobia, and other kind of these social theories bring back to foundations of those that in especially Western histories that become really established and prominent, to the history of witch hunts. And one of the things is a lot to be said about the witch hunts, to remind you that those occurred roughly from 15th century to ended, officially the kind of execution of people as witches actually went on through middle 19th century. So 1842, I think, was the last a formal execution of a person as a witch. Um, Historians and other scholars separate those from inquisitions and other kind of hunting of heretics, because those were carried out for people who were believed to have bad religious beliefs, wrong religious beliefs, that were non-Christians and so forth. So sometimes persecution of Jews or Muslims and Moors is under kind of category of inquisition. And then of course you will, as I talk, you will see that they overlap, but nevertheless the witch hunts begin to occur in a very particular different way. This is looking for people who were believed to be possessed by evil spirits and demons, who more or less gave themselves up to satanic influences. And then, because of this possession by evil and this connection to evil, directly to Satan and demons, but also to other, Satan worshiping communities, they were influencing others by their ideas and making people sick, bad harvests, bad climate, by the way, bad, storms. They could control lots of aspects. They were of social life and emotional life, individual life, and thus they were deemed to be incredibly dangerous. And therefore, the witch hunts look for people who meet these characteristics. And so I want to emphasize here that the witch hunts begin, if you, those of you know your history, after the European plague more or less ends. And there are other plagues and there are other pandemics happening all the time in their times. There's cholera and typhoid fever and all kinds of other outbreaks. But of course, the plague is significant, bubonic plague, because it kills about one third to more of the Europeans, right? And to remind those of you in terms of languaging this plague, that it wasn't it wasn't termed Black Plague, which is we refer to it now, until centuries later. And scholars write about the use of language and what it means to call something black or dark and so forth, and its association with racist colonial ideologies. So I refer to it as European plague, and I want to have you think about the witch hunts as they occur in terms of who is being hunted, what kind of individuals are considered dangerous and demonized, and how do we begin to make connections to today's, some of the today's, what we kind of continue on. So who is responsible for what happens after the plagues, what happens, who is held responsible, what kind of expectations are for people who survive, and so forth. So, witch hunts is not something minor. People kind of, certain leaders like, I'm a witch hunter, this is a witch hunt, and da 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 da. We kind of use this term sometimes, in my view, very lightly. Witch hunts are believed to have been responsible for, remember, it's people who are both, they were identified, brought to court, publicly tried. The trials involved different forms of torture, public torture, and confessions, and they're publicly executed. So the belief is that they between, sometimes the low numbers are within first few hundred years of witch hunts, like so 16th, 17th century. The low numbers is somewhere around 500,000 people. The higher numbers are given by people who believe it was a lot more extensive, and you can't go by documented evidence, is in millions. The highest number I've seen is 9 million. I think people, so that would be enormous numbers in, very, very small cities. They didn't even have that many people. So probably somewhere but it's significant. 85 to 100% of those killed, 85, so in communities, were women, and we'll come to why. They often the scholarship is that very early on, the primarily image of the witch was an older crony hag woman who uses evil vials to attack the community and people, makes children die and the cattle die and the storms appear and so forth. So a lot of people say it is in part because after the plague, the most vulnerable in the community would have been older women. And to remind you all, of course, I live in a world where it is filled with spirit. Its spirituality is at the heart of who they are and what they do. Thinks there are Satan, demons, and God and angels. They have saints, and it's very, very oriented towards a view of the world as infused with essentially spiritual powers and beings, so forth. And of course, the people, if you are older widow, people write about it. And what you do is you study herbs, and you come and do X, Y, and Z, and say, I'll pray for you, I'll curse you, and so forth. That's also how people, of course, use their voice and power to not strip them of, oh, like say they were just kind of, they weren't at all interested in these things. People, everybody practiced, kind of this religion believed in old magic. It's very much part of their world. But what becomes to happen is that what scholars write about is that those people begin to be really demonized and seen as agents of Satan. So what I write about are looking at documents, original documents, and they're out there and they're translated. So Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, comes out. It's written by two Catholic priests, German Catholic priests. And I German, yeah, German, in late 15th century. To give you a sense of, it was one of the first books to be ever published as a printed. It came out within first 100 years. It was republished, reprinted in 33 editions. To give you a comparison, the Bible, of course, considered like the most important book of their time, came out in 7.5, people argue 7 or 8 editions at the time. It is preached about, it is discussed at fairs, there are pamphlets, there are books, and it's a very systematic, rather rational book if you ever read it, and very lengthy about the why witches are real, who are the witches, and how do you torture them, and how do you punish them, and why it's so important for communities to do. And so, if you read it from that standpoint, you begin to see what is identified particularly as a demonic person and demonic state and bad human being and so forth. What I write about is one of my great interests is about demonizing emotions. So think about it, like, right, you just as a community survived enormous plague, and there are other plagues, and they are also they go through what's known as a little ice age. So they have a climate crisis, people write about. And so there's uncertainty and grief and changes and shifts, and there's industrialization, early forms of industrialization occurring. All of these shifts are occurring, and you begin to say that certain people who feel um, angry or sad in the midst of all of this are people who could be identifiably demon possessed, because if you're happy and you are cheery and you kind of believe in God's will and so forth, you are all right. And so Malleus Maleficarum, and by the way, there are all kinds of other manuals to remind you that both Catholic and Protestant cultures hunted witches. Protestant cultures were even more aggressive. So Scottish, Puritans here in the US, they were a lot more aggressive about witch hunting than um, Catholic cultures. By the way, Italy, Spain had Inquisition in bigger numbers, but not as many witch hunts. And it's done by civic authorities. So there's a formal study of demonology at universities to remind you also that this is Enlightenment era. This is not Renaissance and Enlightenment overlap. This is not Dark Ages. This is not before the plague. This is all kind of leading up to modern times. So at the same time, scientific Disciplined enlightenment is happening, universities are formed, there are formal studies of demonology, and these are rational kind of, but taking up ideas about God and demons and how to find demonized people and so forth. So one of them was looking for people who are angry and sad, so melancholy. So one of the manuals is written by King James the First of Scotland, and Scottish witch hunts are considered one of the most bloody, violent, problematic. They're horrific. So it's King who writes this manual. It's called Demonology and something, something, something. So in it, he, for example, says melancholy is a sign of kind of bad demonized blood and witches, and then it bleeds into others. And someone who is sad is, and melancholy is by, opens themselves up to demonic possessions and so forth. And so they often, anger, and but including, for example, if the woman is angry during the trial, that is an incorrect emotion, and that is a sign of angry witchy woman and so forth. So number one way that witches were described was as angry. So different versions of angry they are, and so in the images of them are these angry witches and so forth. So hold that in mind for kind of where we come to today with quote unquote positive psychology, and what emotions are considered negative and what they are considered as unhealth. What are they considered as bad? Who feels those emotions? Who are the communities that grieve, that have anger towards conditions of their lives, and how those then plays back in them and said, what the problem is your emotions. The problem is your sadness and anger and so forth. And so that's begins to be very articulated, very well, kind of created as a split in the culture and how it's presented. So I'm very interested in that. And in depth psychology, we'll talk about it, what it means to have a diverse, to me, is like a rainbow of human emotions and experiences, and how vital it is in times of grief and sorrow and loss to feel full emotions of grief, sorrow, and loss, and how anger is so vital to our forms of resistance and discontent and action in the world, and boundaries, just regular old boundaries. So to move on, one of the other things that was hunted was wrong knowledge and dangerous producers of knowledge. So remember, Aaron Reich in English, who wrote about the witch hunts, write about that the fact, and a lot of others too, that universities are formed and official professions are formed at this time. And who is permitted and not permitted to be official holders of knowledge. It is not women, and it's also not minorities, and so and not people in poverty, or so forth, who gets to go to universities, Oxfords and Sorbonne and so forth and so on, who gets to be a doctor. And so midwives are considered to be a particular threat. So Malleus Maleficarum calls midwives the most dangerous evildoers of all. And so midwives are hunted really regularly. In fact, in the witch hunting kind of documents, they're often singled out. Like we just executed, they would say, we burned 60 witches in this town on this, in this month. Of those 60, 14 were midwives. And so they, kind of recognize them as particularly dangerous. Midwives, of course, up to then were hubs of social life information. They were at birth, at death, and they were healers. They knew a lot of all kinds of information, but knowledge is in their hands is considered very much dangerous. It's removed. By the way, in Scotland, the practice of midwifery itself there was laws to say that means you practice witchcraft, and the women could be killed just for practice of midwifery. And through like late 19th century, the laws were The other piece of it was that knowledge itself for women is dangerous. To remind you, they go to the origin story, the Eve and Adam, and to think, what did Eve want? Eve wanted knowledge, and that knowledge of good and evil, and not supposed to have good and evil knowledge, and so forth. And so, but then what they write about, Malleus Maleficarum and other documents, they begin to prove that women also are incapable of truly knowing. So they use phrases like women are intellectually like children, women have intellectual incapacities, women are their minds and brains, and they begin to use brains later in Enlightenment sciences, but their minds are not made for true knowledge. So they twist it, and because of their hunger to know, but they don't understand, they get possessed with evil knowledge and satanic ideas and so forth and so on. So women's intellectual life, and then also kind of minority intellectual life, begins to be this marker of who is intelligent, who isn't, what is intelligence, and so forth. So the last thing, of course, which most people emphasize because it's so visible, is that sexualities of all kinds in women's bodies um, are very much a display. I mean, try, like some of the descriptions, if you read that, they would bring a young one in Scotland, lots of young women, teen girls, they would be accused. Someone could accuse, say, I felt lust when I saw this young woman, and she's a witch. So she would be brought in, she would be stripped. They would look for what's called devil's mark, or devil's tit. They would look for those. They would say this woman secretly has sex with Satan and demons. And so they would shave women, and they would look for marks of demons and devils on their genitalia and anus. And so and then they would sit them naked often, and they would to be watched. And they would, for example, did things like, if she moves, does she move? If you prick her, does she do this? It's pretty much like it's the documents. It's if she sits and naked, does she attract? They would call demon kind of um, um, animals, which would be bugs and mice and vermin. And so the witch calls these to herself. I mean, it's very sexualized forms of kind of torture and viewing women, and very much focus on their sexualities and bodies. And that the women are full of lust, they can't control their sexuality, they're seductress, they are, and so forth and so on. And so that was a huge part. And of course, to remind those of you thinking about same-sex sexuality, absolutely, of course, against the natural God's law and so forth. So a lot of satanic kind of orgies are described as very much around same-sex, both between women and between men. So how do you demonize sexualities? All right, to move forward for us, many of us more currently think about plagues like Spanish influenza. When I write to, then I kind of been interested, of course, moving forward to development of social Darwinism and eugenics, because those are central to psychology, Western psychology. And depth psychology begins to emerge in these times, right? And by the way, Freud is very much, all of these people are aware of witch hunts. Freud, in his letters, you can see that he actually purchases the copy of Malleus Maleficarum, and he wonders what in the world is going on. And for example, he's very much focused on things like that women confess to all these sexual fantasies under torture. And so he's thinking about, like, well, what is sexual fantasy? What sexual desire? Is there sexual trauma? He, for example, thought that people on both sides were like extremely sexually traumatized. So he's trying to figure out what's going on with the witch hunts. So it becomes influential in a way that he begins to think about sexual desire, sexual fantasy, sexual repression, sexual violence, because that is all of his early work, is about these kind of sexual dynamics and the impact of what inside of us, what's outside, how we relate to society and our sexual bodies, and how it creates a tremendous amount of psychological conflict and distress. So that's witch hunts continuation, and there are other connections I can make for you, but I write about that, but we can talk about at another time. But in his time and their time, Remember that early 20th century, one of the Spanish influenza is, right there, what, 17, 18, 19, around World War One. I sometimes read about it that they were like Spanish flu with both significant, but also there were so many other um, issues and problems, including enormously violent, very, very distressing and visible war, right? People are coming off the front lines with violence to their bodies and minds never seen before by them, right? So it's kind of, there's revolutions happening, a lot of other things. One of the concerns they have, more even to my experience reading, than influenza is sexually transmitted disorders, especially syphilis, also gonorrhea. Remember, they have no medication for these and so forth. So they treat those as kind of, they call them plagues and so forth. There's also colonialism, eugenics, racism, there's a ton of patriarchy. But in these times, depth psychology emerges. So what they're looking at, what they're writing and responding to, are these kind of dynamics of loss. So Freud writes mourning and melancholy. A lot of it has to do with war survival. There's eugenic context, there's biologizing, and the Darwin and Galton begin to say, well, certain people are fit. Guess what? Those people are wealthy, intelligent, healthy, happy, and so they create ways of translating it into language of science and measuring it and then proving it and saying, well, these people don't meet these criteria and therefore they're melancholy indigenous, like, or melancholy natives and aggressive African blacks and women who are intellectually like children, which is, by the way, Darwin's quote, and Galton repeats it. So anyhow, so these are the times into which depth psychology emerges. In an counterpoint, Western psychology comes up, and it is very much interested in eugenic. Eugenic slogan is prediction and control, and human engineering of social experiences, speeding up the evolution. So there's a lot of identification of unfit people, and it's done rather than kind of early times what we with witch hunts. It's done through measurement, what is statistics and measurement. And American psychology has become very much embedded in it. So as I finish, I'm going to kind of go fairly quickly and through these slides. You guys can rewatch and see them. But what then mainstream psychologies and depth psychologies, where they, diverge. In depth psychologies, it is becomes human science, which uses natural science, it uses bodily experiences and sometimes struggles with those. But it is looks at constructed relational social experiences. Always there's culture, always society, always early relationships. Freud develops a perspective that's called the talking cure. So it's done through listening. There is individual unconscious, there's a central role of relationship, there's social construction of all reality, and they talk about it from early on in their own language. And there's a collective unconscious, there's group shared experiences. In mainstream psychology, it's always just natural and biological. Experimenting on animals tells us what we can know about humans, it's through measurement and testing. Everything is kind of, they use a language of control. You have to control behavior, self-control, control this, control that. Introspection and consciousness, that comes, they don't believe it. It's not about yourself, you, meaning, any of it. It has to be excluded. And social context is almost always either minimized or denied. So I want to also kind of think about that Western psychology, including depth psychology, have this very much particular paradigm. Even us struggle like, are we science? We're science. We're scientific. That we also universalize, right? Including in depth traditions, that we tend to turn to patriarchal explanations. We ignore other forms of social behavior. It is colonialist. We always like, our view is better, ethnocentric, these kind of primitive people and so forth. It is neoliberal or capitalist, which is kind of like, well, it's all individual and up to me, and da 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 da. It's pull yourself by your bootstraps kind of ideology, and non-historic. So we struggle with same paradigms, and sometimes in our program we're trying to name them, question them, but we also, kind of have to interact with these views because there are other ways where mind, body, spirit are not split, where biology is always constructed. What's the brain? What's the body? What's the gene? It's like we kind of pump ideas and ideologies into those. There's always context, there's always history, it's always culturally, it's not universal, that we need to look at anti-colonialist liberation perspective and wonder about being activist. Okay, I'm finishing up. This is our campus, and plan to, after pandemic, that you come and be with us. We've been around for 30 plus years as a clinical program, and we check out our website, study our faculty, study, kind of look up at our alumni newsletters. I want to briefly say, who do we look for? We, an application, most of all, if you hear, we're very much looking for like-minded people. If you're hungry to study depth psychology, if you're interested, curious, you've been learning about it, this is probably the largest factor. I use the statistical wheel. How about that for taking master's tools as a, kind of Audre Lorde's idea. But clinical relational capacity. Can you relate to human beings? Can you, be present for them? It's very important. Can you be with yourself? I guess I put it 10%, but we also ask you to be in your own therapy. Do you have a self-reflective capacity? Have you been in therapy analysis? Are you curious about yourself? Are you capable to be with others who are profoundly different than you, both in terms of conditions, mental states, but also, of course, differences across racial, gender, national lines, religious, and so forth. We are a doctoral program. We're heavily based on theory, thinking, understanding, lots of reading, and then application of those to clinical work. And then, there's practicalities of like, can it be done for you? Can you travel to us? And so forth. So that's that. Okay. In the open house, I talked about, we have many accreditations with APA that typically accredits only dominant mainstream views these days. We emphasize clinical training. We have therapy requirement. We have wonderful faculty. All of us have depth connected. We are committed to issues of social justice and examining and changing our role and our views, and being as a community together and having difficult dialogues that are so important. We're a human science tradition, remember that, and we're adult learning models. Hence, you travel to us in one intensive weekend and then you stay at home. Okay, this is, I think, almost done, but this is Anna Freud's letter. Someone wrote to her and said, what does it take to become a psychoanalyst? And I want to highlight kind of, I think it's a remarkable letter. She says, you do need to be a love of truth, scientific truth, and personal truth. And rather than discomfort of meeting unpleasant facts, whether they belong to world outside of your own or your own inner person. So truth of your own experience, your own subjectivity. And then she says, further, psychologists should have interest beyond limits of the medical field, sociology, religion, literature, history. Otherwise, your outlook on your patient remains too narrow. So preparation beyond, you said, psychoanalytic, you ought to be a great reader, acquainted with literature of many countries and cultures, and so forth and so on. Does that answer your question? So I hope it does. So many pathways with doctoral degrees, especially PhD. You are going to be, definitely we're training you to be a clinician. Majority of our, I would say all of our graduates practice in one way or another. But you can do consultation, you can do court work and advocacy at the doctoral level. You can do assessments, supervision, teaching, research, writing. You can do all kinds of other interdisciplinary work. And also, part of it to show up for your own work through depth psychology, always are saying you're an instrument of healing, you're an instrument of writing, and how do you show up for the world? Okay, this is us and me. Thank you so much for participating. We have a little bit. Oh, I was watching on time the recording, but I can stop here, and please, let's do conversation and questions and answers. I thought I had shorter time, so.
That's okay. We can start taking questions. So a reminder at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A box. So if you click that, you can type any questions for Dr. Yakushko. And maybe while we wait for some questions, perhaps you could share what you're looking for when an applicant submits a file. So you did go over a little bit what you're looking for, but perhaps specifically, what are you looking for in the personal statement and their transcripts, letters of recommendation?
Definitely. So, having heard the type of applicant we're looking for, think of your one, first and foremost, your application is very professional. You are saying, I would like to study in a professional educational setting and become a psychologist. So, kind of treat it in that way, but then bring depth psychology into it. So, with that in your personal statement, describe to us what about our program and depth psychology and becoming a clinician draws you. Why? Because sometimes people submit and it's unclear to you, do you want to be psychologists and do you understand what depth psychology or is and how you kind of how is it personal to you. With that, what I discourage and want to kind of remind you as applicants is what we're not looking for is kind of a letter of confessions or revelation about your personal struggles in life, because again, professional application, so forth. But if you make a statement, which all of us, recognize in depth psychological fields, and by the way, Freud emphasized that no matter where you are in your career, every 5 years you have to re-enter analysis because you are the instrument of healing. You have to do your own inner work. So saying something like, through my own therapy or analysis, I came to understand myself deeper. And I began to think about, what kind of work I want to do and how I want to show up in the world. That is totally kosher. The content of your therapy, I would say, keep between you and your therapist or analyst. So that's part of a personal statement, is narrating kind of your interest in depth psychology, our education, the kind of recognition, and what about it is kind of going to be, why do you want to do this work and why do you want to be depth clinical psychologist. With personal statement to kind of like write it professionally, but of course personally, engagingly. But sometimes people, the stream of consciousness is really difficult to follow. It might kind of speak to you, but other people keep it in mind, the kind of your readership. Also, here's where we do look all of your transcripts. Doctoral level work and in our program is intensive. Can you do it? Absolutely. I think you need to kind of think about kind of the type of life and engagement with program, but lots of reading and lots of writing and complex reading and writing. And so if you do not have good grades, undergraduate or graduate, it's a red flag to us. I, however, also met students who, for example, here's a typical trajectory. They were psych majors and undergraduate. They sort of hated it, all the animal experiments and so forth. So their grades are kind of low. And then they just like left all that behind, and they for 20 years did something else. And then they discovered depth psychology and they're like, what? There's other psychology and so forth. So you can explain what happened to your grades in your personal statement. Give us an explanation, because if you have really kind of poor grades in some, like, you can also say, I didn't know who I was. I was so lost and I was dealing with, I don't know, family issues coming out, struggling with racism. And it was a really, really difficult experience in college. But here's what I've done since then. And here's why I'm ready for academic work. So you need to explain it. We do look at your transcript and we do look at your letters of references, which should be professional letters of references. It's a big red flag if your friend sends you a letter. So don't ask friends or people who are not like cannot speak to you, because we're asking, you do academic work? Can you do clinical work? Ask people who can speak to that. With that, other pieces of it, we do look at your writing sample. Keep in mind that, okay, some of you have been in traditional programs, so your writing paper might be about, glories of CBT, and you're like, uh-oh, frankly speaking, we will be here kind of thinking about, where does CBT emerge? How do we understand this kind of need to control behavior and emotion? But nevertheless, what we look for, can you articulate an argument and can you write as a scholar? If you haven't written for a long time, take up, we have a reading list in application packages. Take up a kind of key book, in-depth psychology. Take up, Freud or Jung or more contemporary people, and write some kind of like a brief essay, but we're looking for your scholarly voice. I think that's probably, for me, the heart of your application. But the mistake people make is making it generic, non-specific to depth psychology. You also might say something like, if you say something like, I'm so glad to come and study cognitive behavioral therapy and positive psychology. If I ever see something like this, I know for sure you're not looking at our website. And I know for sure you wouldn't be unhappy here. We're looking for students who are capable of being at this high academic level, but who are also like-minded. You have so many choices in psychology to go elsewhere and to do mainstream psychology. We are one of a kind depth psychological clinical psychology training program. Why us? So that's what I want you to kind of think about, articulate, and really like your CV also kind of think about highlighting. Oh, that would be another important thing. We are looking for your clinical capacity. So, what if you feel like I've not been a clinician? That's okay. Many of you have, you've been teachers, you've been volunteers, you have worked with community activism, you have led groups, you've consulted for businesses, you coached people. If you worked with human beings, articulate what that work is about, translate it for us so we can see that you are capable of being. Because if you all you've done in your life is say, I don't know, do something with objects and never show interaction with other human beings, the question would be, is this going to be a good fit? Can you sit across another human being who is suffering, who is intensely human? And can you be in their humanity? Can you make a relational connection? And you need to show that you're capable of that. So, all right, other questions? Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. That was wonderful. And just a reminder, because you signed up to attend this webinar, you can apply to Pacific Graduate Institute for free. I will paste the link in the chat box below. Usually we have a $75 fee, but we're waiving the fee because you attended this webinar. And then after you apply, our apply page is name, phone number, personal information. You can begin emailing documents to applicant@pacifica.edu. Okay,
Great.
let's get into these questions. Okay, so here's an interesting question related to the lecture. um, what or who do you believe the current plague or the pandemic, I'm assuming kind of what populations, um, will this current pandemic demonize, and how can we humanize culture around disease? And then
Such important question.
the example this person gave in the past was, for example, the AIDS crisis, and then gay rights movements coming out of that.
Absolutely, right. It's, there are so many ways, and I didn't get to it, and I try to write and think about, because how do we show up in depth psychologists? We have this pandemic. What do we do with the fact that it is Black and Latinx communities that physically are impacted and medically more than any others in our community? How do we take up this concern? What do we do with notions like, World Health Organization president says herd immunity is an ethical concept, and we have herd immunity discussed. We are like herd of antelopes, fittest survive, then we have immunity and so forth. How do we take up these things? Talk about AIDS epidemic and HIV crisis. Remember the history, like it's easy to forget, is how do we hold up the fact that for years the administration refused to do anything because it was a gay disease, and the kind of how the moralizing, judgmental, homophobic kind of efforts were to to say it's this people's disease. What do we do with Ebola? What do we do with the fact that it's a terrible disease, and we as a world community tend to not create particular treatments for that, but we do with COVID because it affects all of us? What do we do with things like, for example, those of you familiar with addiction kind of paradigms and related to imprisonment and the prison kind of what kind of prison state, what people write about it, what think of it that opioid abuse is an epidemic. It's a health crisis, but people in prisons have filled prisons for years, people for possession, minor possession of marijuana or crack cocaine. And theirs is a terrible, we have with them, we have war on drugs. It is not an health epidemic crisis. It's a war on drugs. And we have to, punish the criminals who do X, Y, and Z. There's so many ways that we have to take up social, collectively, these struggles. And how do we sit with people who face these realities, grieve, feel anger, feel sorrow? So the other side I write about is reading leftist liberal media publishing things from, to me, a very ideologically based positive psychologists that tell us, how do you be happy in pandemic? How do you become happy in pandemic? And they say things like, happiness is genetic and it's 50% genetic. It's like sounds so like, oh, it's in a okay, such a problematic view. Geneticists have been taking it up and up. It's a very eugenicist view. And the people who they cite are people who are funded by far right eugenic pioneer fund. And their citation appear in the Atlantic. And the person says, well, I don't like that it's biological, but I guess science says. What does it mean that the person mostly promoting right now, Laurie Santos, is a primatologist and she compares humans to her monkeys in cages? And she says, they don't, she says, science proves that your environment, your social environment, matters very little. It's less than 10%. It's hardly important. It's all about your genetics and self-control. It's just like, oh, it's a eugenic paradigm. And then she says, my monkeys in cages, they don't think about the future. They don't think about the past. Past doesn't matter. History doesn't matter. They live in the present. And then it moralizes it with Buddhism. And it's just like, I struggle with that. I very much, you can hear, how do depth psychologists show up? Show up for fear and anger and sorrow. How do you recognize, for example, that pandemic has stripped bare some of the social, structural, racist, sexist ideologies and made them visible, and that we live them? How do you recognize fact that for those of you who've been and us traumatized in the past, such pandemics are very re-traumatizing? So there are so many ways that we as depth psychologists have to show up to learn to be with very complex historical and social realities, to be able to acknowledge our own and other people traumatizing experiences, to recognize that we can be happy and angry and upset and meaningful all at the same time. And sometimes when we're told, you should just be happy, like your mother going crazy in a house with full of kids and no resources. But, why don't you think like a monkey in the cage and just be in the present? Has some very socially problematic ideas. And I draw them to eugenicist ideas, back to witch hunting ideas, and begin to think about who gets to feel what emotions, who gets to have what kind of resources, who gets blamed, and so forth. So we need to take up these issues as depth psychologists, as did by the way, early psychoanalysts, if you read any kind of historical work on early psychoanalysts, they took up ideas of poverty and inequality. They were, by the way, godless Jews. And so they were, Freud hardly escaped the Nazis and so forth. So there are so many ways that we can learn and connect to, but we also have to attend to the way that depth psychology is always can be taken up by dominant paradigms, and we're all full of it, and we have to decolonize and do our own work and show up with people in their humanity in our own over and over and again. So I get very passionate about it, and kind of maybe a couple more questions, but I'm sorry I didn't get, but it's to me would be, you're right, I'm sorry I kind of build up the historical part, but I try to not get to the fact that we can do this work and do it meaningfully, and we can build on some of the work of others who've resisted and who try to reimagine the world and reconnect. We can keep, but also being very careful with the fact that when we're vulnerable in times of plague, in times of climate change, we tend to split off our own discontent into groups and to others. And what I am really aware looking forward after this pandemic is that how we will hold the narratives of like, well, those people didn't take care of themselves, and those people were just like evolutionary unfit, and not racehorse theory, and now those people don't have a right to be angry or sad. We just all need to be happy and move on, and da da da. I'm going to really, I try to pay attention to the ways that it gets to be moved into the kind of splitting and dissociation projections, which creates real suffering for groups of people. For some of us, it like, makes us feel like, oh, look at me, I'm vaccinated and I am so good. And it's all because of myself, so forth, rather than the fact that incredibly privileged, people get privileged access to healthcare, right? And so anyhow, moving on, we are like 1 minute. So write to me. I will, Jessica, can you put my email? People, please email me
Yes,
with
I
questions.
will. And if
It's my first initial last name, oyakushka@pacifica.edu. Oyakushka@pacifica.edu. I'll be happy to follow up. I'm sorry, I kind of at the end. Maybe last question. What's would be a good question?
yes, I'll put your contact information. And yes, let's take one more question. This is another great question, very relevant. What aspect of depth psychology has been most applicable for you during your practice in the clinical setting?
I think it's, to connect to this, to me, it's this show up for diverse ways humanity is, that we to be curious, to be listening, and to be listening to myself and to be curious about myself. And with that, I need to do my own analysis and my own therapy because of the unconscious patterns, but also to be very much paying attention to what is said and unsaid with me, with others. So I think it's, to me, it's this commitment to listening, but listening at multiple levels. It's curiosity. It is always to be surprised by the way that we are so human in different ways, but we also are swimming in the sea of being told this is what it means to be human. And so, including me and including my patients. And I think with that too is to be open to ways to how we often also resist and reimagine our lives in really divergent ways, and that we through this work get to be a companions, to attenders, we fellow travelers, but also someone who is actively shows up in a relational, real relational way for people's journey to heal, to understand themselves, to expand themselves and to redefine themselves. And that is such a privilege to me and an honor, and I feel like that's what I give myself. And so at the kind of ending to, I'm in my own psychoanalytic training, and so I'm keep learning, looking at oneself, absorbing, learning new things. And I hope that Pacifica, for those of you who are interested, becomes a space of really both inner discovery and connection to humanity, and being working with humans in this really really dynamic way that's doesn't go by manuals. And so so I'll end there. It's 1 o'clock. I am thank you. I can't see you on the webinar format. I thank you for your interest. Those of you who watch it later, thank you for your interest. And but I also recognize, find your own path and what feels right to you in the world of psychology. And I hope again you stay human, alive, that you are safe, you and your families and communities are well and safe. And good luck with these decisions, and be in touch with me and with us. And Jessica and Gavin, huge thank you for helping. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. And if you have further questions, if you have general admissions questions, please feel free to email admissions@pacifica.edu. We can also connect you to an admissions advisor. And then again, Dr. Yakushko's contact information is
Email.
there below. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all. Bye.